let me, so he emailed me at 11:01 saying, sorry for the delay, and he's registering. So I would guess he's going to come in any second now. In the meantime, I'll talk about um, just things that have been going on with me. So I'm starting a legal nonprofit, but it's in the state of California, and I'm a lawyer, right? So I thought this is going to be pretty easy to um, be able to do all these forms. You know, it's not like nonprofits aren't my primary area of practice, but corporate law is actually. So I thought I should be able to do these in corporations, but I'm also really bad at filling out forms. I don't know what it is. Like if there's any sort of ambiguity, it's like I will pick up on it and I will fixate on it, and that will basically become like the way that I make a decision. So you can go ahead and look this up on the California Secretary of State website. The form for filling out a 501c3 is what we call them in the United States, a nonprofit organization that should be tax-free. So I'm trying to get tax exempt status in California. And they sent me like the third or fourth letter being like, oh, we're still missing some stuff from you. And the funny thing is I already got federal tax exemption status, which is that's the IRS statutes section 501c3. I got it forever ago, right? So I'm just waiting on the California one, which doesn't even matter as much. But they, for whatever reason, are being much more particular. And then they said that I need to amend the articles of incorporation, which is really kind of a hassle to do. It's not easy to do, and it's kind of a pain to do. And so at first I was like, that's not true. And correctly, the statute doesn't actually say that that's like something that you have to do. But it's just like, you know, this bureaucracy, I guess. Some of you maybe come from countries with even more bureaucracy than mine. But the bureaucracy of it all is, no, we're going to require like very precise things. And the people who are kind of in charge, you know, are like just following a formula, right? And not using their brains, you know, like I understand what it means to have articles of incorporation and like the contents of the articles of incorporation. And specifically, I'm talking about limiting what the corporation is allowed to do. So hundreds of years ago, when they started coming up with the first corporations, they had these charters, right? Like the West Indies Company, right? And the charter was very narrow about like, you're only allowed to go, you know, have this particular travel to go colonize this particular area, whatever it was. And that's how they kind of, because corporations were new and they were just kind of getting used to things. And so anything outside of the ability of the corporation was called ultra vires, a Latin term basically meaning outside the authority of the corporation, because I think, at least in the United States, for every corporation, there had to be a new act of Congress, so a new law passed to create each new corporation. And so it was like this big deal. It was like, oh, are we even going to allow these people to be able to do this? And that was kind of what they thought was the restriction. But that hasn't happened, you know, in the past 100, 150 years. I don't think there's been a case on ultra vires, you know, this concept of like acting outside your capacity of a corporation in the past, you know, 50 years. So it's no longer a thing, but I don't know why it's never been changed in this like California bureaucracy. But these are the sorts of things that like drive me crazy. I don't know. I'm not saying it's necessarily psychopathic. It's just like politically, everything else, I have like this tendency to not like to be controlled, I guess, to think that, you know, like little rules to follow, little check boxes to fill out. I don't like them. You get pretty frustrated with them. I'm terrible at doing it anyways, you know, terrible at filling out forms. So yeah, that's kind of where I am. I have a little brother who is, he just signed up for the Criterion Collection, which is a streaming service. And so his wife sent me the password. She's like, yeah, go ahead and use it. You know, it's just us using it, and you can also use the password. And then I said, thanks, you know, although I haven't used it yet, but just thank you. Thank you for the username, password. You know, maybe I'll use this, maybe I won't. And she's like, just a sweet taste of communism for you, comrade, because they're pretty socialist. They were Bernie Sanders supporters. And that's kind of like the direction that they kind of lean. But I actually think with coronavirus, like I am my most libertarian ever. Like, I think, you know, yes, there are issues. There are market failures. We wish that we could get, you know, personal protective equipment But because of capitalism and because I think largely because of Chinese knockoffs, counterfeits or something, it seems to be very difficult to be able to source like official, these are like legitimate PPE, the masks, the everything else. I think it's going to be a continuing issue, you know, as people say that they have cures for it or say that they have off market kind of uses. So there are a lot of advantages to government regulation into what libertarians often call state capacity, which is like a competent government that's able to kind of do the things that the market is not as good at doing. But I think in this particular situation, like people arguing that there should be even more government interference seems crazy to me, because at least in the United States, if you kind of like read what happened with the CDC, our Center for Disease and Control, and the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, and how the tests kind of got passed, and how there was like a real delay about allowing the other commercial producers of tests to create their own version of a test. I mean, it's just like kind of maddening to see. And I understand that people kind of get used to certain behaviors and they find themselves in a rut and just kind of keep engaging in those behaviors. I'm sure that's like, if you're a bureaucrat, then there's probably a personality that fits for those types of things. You know, they're rule followers, you know, that maybe they don't question the rules. Maybe they don't see it the way that I do and see like rules to be maddening. But that same sort of personality, I think it's harder when it kind of the situation requires a more dynamic approach. Let me email him really quickly again. Okay, he says he'll be there in a moment. What? No.
In the UK, we have a similar confusion where they've actually got companies manufacturing PPE equipment that they're then selling to other countries in Europe because our government can't get around to sanctioning them properly. So they've got a shortage here and they're selling them abroad because the system is such that they've got to check them against a certain criterion, and they haven't got around to doing it. But the companies can't wait because we've got quite a severe lockdown in the UK. So a lot of industries are frozen. So they can't afford to run because they can't afford to get bank loans. So they're having to sell the equipment to Europe rather than use it themselves despite a shortage because our government hasn't got around to ticking the box yet.
Yes.
So it's a lot of this, the way they do things is irrational. But then the emotional tension is very high.
Yes.
Most people are acting. We've got irrationality you wouldn't believe. Like in the States, we've got people who are marching against being locked down for the virus, wearing masks against the virus that they say we don't have to be locked down against.
Right.
What fascinates me, we've got people like anti-vaxxers and are really coming out the woodwork. People who have decided that vaccines that save thousands of lives are a problem, and they make stuff up. And a couple of people I know have got banned from Facebook. Crazy stuff like, you know, if you double dose vitamin D, you know, that will offer you some measure of protection, but obviously it's not a cure. And then we have the flip side where we have the crooks, the snake oil salesman, who will sell you any combination of drug existing or made up. And this is supposed to be a cure for the condition.
Yes, you know, I can see that. The thing that I'm kind of like even less concerned about that, I guess. I know it's like, you know, with our stimulus that we had in the United States, there were a lot of people being like, the wrong people are going to get the money. And that was like a huge concern. But a lot of other people thought, well, you know, if it doesn't like work out perfectly, if we don't have a perfect distribution, the wrong people getting the money, who cares? As long as we're getting the money to the right people.
Yeah, we're the same. You're never going to eliminate the criminal element. So if you wait for the criminal, in fact, I think we spend a lot of time avoiding the criminal element at the detriment of everyone. There's always going to be a group of people who break the rules for financial gain, even though their own lives are at risk. It's simply their circumstances, their personality, whatever. And so if you keep legislating for the worst, you end up not helping anyone. So, and this is interesting because we're now in a global situation, which despite the world being seen as global, it isn't really until something like this happens and people realize the borders don't really matter and that everyone can be affected by this. So every country has got to adapt. And
Yes.
it doesn't take long for the recriminations to start with the various governments blaming each other.
You know, your thing about people being so paranoid about the criminal element is an interesting one, because in the United States, we have a concept where everybody is presumed innocent until proven guilty. And then
Yeah.
we have a very high standard for proof, the burden of proof, in order to convict somebody for criminal charges. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. So basically, if you have any doubt in your mind, any doubt that's reasonable, not a fantastic one like it was aliens, but if you have
Yeah,
any doubt that's reasonable, you
it's the
cannot
same.
convict.
Interestingly, we have like similar to the States, a jury system. And one of the things they're looking to change is they want to go to certain European countries. They only have a judge and the two lawyers, and that's how they decide case law. However, that isn't really efficient because obviously it's vastly open to corruption, either deliberate or just time pressure. People start second guessing the results of the cases rather than have a jury system.
Mm.
So we've got a bit of a bottleneck, obviously, because of the lockdown. People can't attend. Well, you have to be 2 meters apart from everybody. So you
Mm-hmm.
can't have any kind of gathering of any significant a number of people. So the jury system is starting to break down. So, but I've actually known people in these countries who say that is open to corruption. You have to have a jury system where, and it is reasonable. That's the same with us because I did jury duty. That was quite fun. I actually turned both the cases round. First one was easy. It was horrible. It was somebody with trafficking. But the second one was someone who was supposed to have stolen mobile phones because he left them in his van. But the people who were checking the van, because they were lazy, it was a Friday, they stopped him outside the depot, not inside the depot.
Mm.
So therefore, there was a doubt whether he was going to keep the phones or not.
Oh, yes.
He was probably guilty, but when you're on jury duty, after a while, you sort of find ways to keep it interesting.
You know, and that is the sort of thing, like if that is our rule, and there can be plenty of people who disagree with that being a rule, but if that's kind of the rule, then let's apply it to all circumstances. I know I've kind of mentioned this on Twitter. I think maybe I mentioned this in the first video, but like I see a lot of people applying a rule, to one set of circumstances, and then they're like, this is a new set of circumstances. So we're just going to abandon the rule. We're going to abandon the rule, for
That's not
instance.
right.
Yeah,
It
that
needs
it's
to be
more important to do good than harm, that's more important to
Yeah.
give the money to the people that deserve it, or to, I think there is a very good parallel to this idea of, yes, if you have the idea that innocent until proven guilty, you are going to let some guilty people go free, but that's
Yeah.
okay. We just have, like, to have different trade-offs is not a different concept. These trade-offs aren't even that different than other ones that we've encountered. It's still death, and there are precautions that we can do to help mitigate death. And we do this all the time. We do this when we decide whether we're going to put in a traffic light at a particular intersection. We do this when we allow people to go a particular speed on a particular road. We do this when we have any sort of regulations. I think a really interesting one right now in California is that we have such strict regulations about how food can be labeled. And now we have kind of a crisis because we have all this food, chicken breast, cheese, and stuff that were meant, that were meant for like pizza parlors or other restaurants. And instead, they can't be sold to consumers directly now that these restaurants have been closed. So they're just destroying the food. There's actually been quite a bit of like destruction of food, like just dumping milk, into the farm, just like instead of actually harvesting the turnips, they're just churning them back into the earth. And I think
bad. I mean, in the UK, there's a lot of what they're doing is they're trying to redistribute it to food banks and things like that. Because for people who have obviously lost their livelihoods with the shift. So yeah, it's interesting how these things work because like we get the same thing like restaurants and pubs, for example, even though beer and lagers can last a long time, they've got a rule for how long they're considered viable. And if they exceed that duration, it's like 3 weeks in some cases, then they would not be allowed to sell the beer, even if the pub was to open. So therefore, they have to either give it away or
Yeah.
throw it away, whether it's viable or not. I suppose you have to consistency through rules, because if you've got a consistent rule for everything, you can see where the outliers are and where things deviate. Whereas if you say if you try to adapt to every circumstance, you just end up with no control whatsoever.
Right. And
Mm.
the idea, I think, is this is the primary theory of ethics. Like if you have an ethical
Mm.
rule, the
Mm.
ethics are going to be able
Mm.
to be applied in all circumstances. So for one, like there are legal ethics, but there are also medical ethics, right? The do no harm, the Hippocratic Oath is the predominant
Mm.
one of medicine. And that's the one that they've
Mm.
made a determination is the one that they're going to go by. And so they've been criticized now, do no harm, because they're like, well, why aren't you trying
Why-
absolutely everything? You know, why aren't you trying this off-brand use of the medication or whatever else it is? But, you know, I actually have more respect for people who stick to their same set of kind of like ethical rules, I guess, than I do people that stick to a bureaucratic rule. You know, like to be able to make that distinction. Is this a bureaucratic rule or is this the underlying ethical rule? And I think,
Ethics started as a branch of logic, so ethical values tend to be fairly absolute. But then, like you said, is someone just ticking a box? And people do, as you said, get into that habit, and that's not a good thing. So, but it is a judgment call, I suppose, because it's going to be difficult. And of course, people who are in positions like that, as you said earlier, they tend to be the type of personalities that don't question.
you know, you make a really good point about ethics and logic because, you know, ethics, I think that most ethical systems that I can at least think of off the top of my head, they're trying to get at a particular result. And they're trying to say for the most of the situations, this is going to be the particular outcome we're trying to achieve. And I think bureaucratic systems, what they kind of miss out there is they're like a process for the sake of having a process. Like we need some way to train the people who come in new, you know, the new people who are like now in charge of the nonprofits for California handling the paperwork. What are we supposed to tell them to do? Do we trust them to make their own judgments, or do we have to have some sort of process? And if so, what should the process be? And I think a lot of times when people are just coming up with processes, and I say this having like been involved in a lot of the development of these processes, either, you know, when I taught at universities, being involved with like, here's the legal process, for instance, for how we handle the development of intellectual property by the professors or the students who are using the university laboratories, right? And sometimes there's a connection to something that's real, and sometimes it's just like, well, we have to have some sort of process. You know, you either drive on the right side of the road or you drive on the left. Does it really matter which it is? You just kind of like choose. It's like arbitrary at a certain point. But then when you get these bureaucrats in there who are like, no, it has to be the right, you know, that's God's will or something. Or, you know, at least that's politically what we sometimes get in the United States, that it's God's will that this thing should happen. Or that there's some secret, you know, advantage to driving on the right versus the left. They don't understand it has no connection at all to outcome.
No, it doesn't really matter. I suppose when you mention legal, it's interesting that you got to be able to be a non-profit through the federal government faster than the California rule.
Yeah.
Is that because of the nature of California? I've worked there, the businesses there tend to be very litigious, and of course you've got Hollywood and all that. So you think it's just because there's so much legal activity there that they're a bit more?
You know, I would say that what has happened is the federal government was traditionally stricter about these sort of regulatory requirements. And they have gotten less because they were getting inundated with requests. So as long as you're a nonprofit that's relatively small, which they essentially define as $50,000 or less, which my nonprofit is right now, you know, maybe it will stay that way for several years. Once it kind of gets above that, I'll have to do more federal kind of regulatory stuff, right? California has not really taken a page from the federal government on this particular issue. I'm trying to unmute people. They haven't taken a page from the federal government on this issue, and that they still are being like just as regulatory as before. It's almost like they just got in a pattern, a habit of doing it. So I'll give you kind of another example. And I think it relates kind of to what people say pandemic theater. You know, pandemic theater being stuff that we're just doing for the sake of looking like we're doing something, for the sake of looking like we're taking this seriously, but it's not actually connected to achieving a particular purpose. It's not, in fact, likely to achieve a particular purpose, right? So in my location. They have had the beaches shut down for the past few weeks or something. And there's been like a kind of a lot of outcry because we actually have quite a bit of beach space, and people were asking, at least for the surfers, to be able to go out to the beach. There's like, I think of all the studies, because I have been kind of inundated with the research regarding outside transmission of coronavirus. And there's only one instance, and it was just between two people. There's never been a mass kind of collection of people getting coronavirus spreading outdoors. And especially where I'm from, it's very sunny. It's now currently very hot, and coronavirus does not survive long in those particular conditions. So people have been asking the different cities, different coastal cities, to open. Finally, the county has opened up the beaches, but then the various cities are like, well, why are we opening up now versus before? Like some of the cities are reluctant because they're like, we haven't seen any change in the numbers, the number of cases or the number of things. So why are we opening it up now? And I guess the answer to that is possibly maybe there was no answer at the beginning. Maybe they just closed down the beaches for no reason, and now we're opening it up because we made a mistake. And I actually prefer that. We don't have to have a reason for opening it if there was no reason in the first place for shutting down these particular things. So I think that's kind of an interesting, like, related concept of what we've been talking about, this sort of ad hoc, which is like a philosophy, a set of ethics is trying to achieve a particular outcome. And then there are these other things that are just this like regulatory, bureaucratic, it's just a system for the sake of having a system. And often people are not able to sort of understand the difference. And I think this happens too in a lot of other circumstances. And I think people misunderstand their own morality this way too, in which they assume, okay, this is something that we've been asked to do, is not leave the house. And now there are people saying that if you do leave your house, then you should be like locked up. Like I've seen somebody suggest that if you are running in public and you're not wearing a mask, you should be locked up. I've even seen people say death penalty. If you're running in public, you should get the death penalty for running in public. And I think that sort of stuff is kind of ridiculous. I see that he's just emailed, and maybe he has just entered. Joseph, are you
hi.
our guest?
I got a question when I get the chance.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I ask?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I listened to your book as an audiobook on Audible about like 4 years ago, and I've like been a fan since.
Mm-hmm.
I got like 2 questions for you.
Yes.
Sure. I was wondering, for the narrator of the book, like the narrating voice, she is brilliant. Was wondering, like, were you the one who chose her or the publisher? But like,
the publisher chose her, and
yeah.
It's funny. I've gotten. Let me plug in. I think it's like just a little bit slow, and if I like plug in the internet, it will improve. Joseph, so I've heard like both people say both ways, that they say she's like a little bit creepy, and then other people say that she's brilliant. But you take the side of brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I was hoping, like, if you could like please consider her for the next book.
Okay.
Like not only like as a matter of consistency, but like also her voice really matches like your personality, or your character, the subject of the book, like, which comes across as like sophisticated, intriguing, and Machiavellian. Like, I mean Machiavellian in a positive way. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes. So I will definitely consider that. You'd be surprised though how little I have to do with that. Like, I didn't even know they were making an audiobook. I was just searching on Amazon and then saw that they had made it. So maybe that's that I don't do a good job reading forms. It's funny because I'm an attorney. I should be better at reading forms, following instructions, but I'm not. And then you had a second question?
Sure. So the second question, you mentioned that you're a Latter-day Saint.
Yes.
I was wondering, like, so with your personality, do you currently hold a temple recommend? And were you always able to maintain a temple recommend?
I will say yes. Yes, I do currently hold a temple recommend. Yes, I have always been able to maintain a temple recommend, but I did not get a temple recommend until I was like 25 or 26. Like I guess I had the what we call limited use ones
Mm-hmm.
for when you are a teenager, but I did
Mm-hmm.
not go to the temple. And I think part of the reason why is because I did not until 25, 26 is because I did not, for other people, it would be kind of like going to the temple would be like a confirmation. It would be
Sure.
like, yeah, like a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah or something. It's like a further dedication to your faith. And so I did
Sure.
not choose to do that until I was 25 or 26. But since then, I have maintained, although it's been a little dicey a couple
Mm-hmm.
times. And luckily, I've had some pretty good bishops who
Mm-hmm.
I think understood that I was not, for the most part, this is something we've talked about in kind of previous videos as well. For the most part, I don't think sociopaths are intending to do bad things. In fact, I was watching Killing Eve season 2
Mm-hmm.
with my boo last night, and I won't try to do any spoilers, but at one point she's just kind of following these people, following these strangers, and you wonder, what is she doing? And then we kind of talked about it afterwards, and it seems really menacing that she's following these strangers, and you are honestly concerned that maybe she's angry enough in that moment that she'll do something bad to them, kind of arbitrarily. If you've seen the show, maybe you'll kind of recognize which episode this is. And
What's
we
the
were
name
talking
again? The name of the show?
Killing Eve.
Oh, gotcha. Uh-huh.
Yeah, a BBC show.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, the character's psychopathic, right? And so we're talking afterwards about like what was the psychology of this particular scene? Did she actually mean to hurt the people that she was stalking? And I think we kind of both agreed, or I suggested, and I think she agreed, that she had no real purpose. She was just kind of acting impulsively. So I think that there's kind of two behaviors with psychopaths. I think there's like the very purposelessness one, like that there's no purpose at all, like the person, it's just pure impulse, that it's like, let's just see where this leads kind of thing. And there's almost no self-reflection going on. There's no like, I'm trying to accomplish this particular thing. There's just this like, it's almost like somebody else is driving in that moment. And I think that behavior is pretty rare, but when it happens, it's pretty severe. Can lead to pretty severe consequences. And then there's kind of the flip side for psychopaths, which is what I sometimes call kind of an over orchestration, right? Like everything has to be controlled, everything has to be predicted, everything has to be set in motion, like a puppet master. Like everybody is your puppet and you're controlling everybody and kind of manipulating everything to happen in a particular way. So I think these two behaviors that you see in psychopaths, they're pretty opposite each other, because the one is this hyper control, this hyper management of all the circumstances and people surrounding them. And the other one is this kind of lack of control, which is just like there's no purpose in mind. There's no outcome oriented behavior. It's just kind of doing something. And there's not maliciousness either. There's not really any thought process at all happening in those moments. And I think, unfortunately, that's when most of the very negative kind of antisocial behaviors happen.
Gotcha.
So, thank you, Joseph.
No problem.
So, guys, I think we're almost at the end of of our meeting, because it will cut out, I think, in just a couple of minutes, because it has a 40-minute time limit. But we will try to reschedule with Arthur. He emailed and he said, it did sound simple, really. Unfortunately, I'm dealing with Murphy's Law, meaning I experience every single possible technical issue, including the OS, the browser, the Wi-Fi. So hopefully we'll be able to meet up with him next week. In fact, maybe we'll just schedule again for a week from today. Hopefully he'll be able to make it. And so I will give you more details about that soon, but I think it's going to cut out pretty soon. Does anybody else have any other questions before we end?
How many minutes left?
I think just like a minute or two.
Yeah, I'll do one question quickly. You mentioned like the church's role, given they're explicit, like you sort of appreciate it. You mentioned in the book that you appreciated that, and it helped you, like, to give you this prosthetic moral compass. But you also mentioned that at the same time, at times you bend the rules, and you mentioned the example of the green tea, drinking green tea. And I was wondering, like, by going to the temple a couple of times, like throughout the years, were you able to suppress the suppress this desire to bend the rules of like the drinking versus the green tea? Like, were you able, like, yeah? What do you
Yes, it's a good question. So to kind of like let everybody else know who's maybe like less familiar with like Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint theology,
Mhm.
to go to the temple, you have to adhere to particular moral standards. And one of the questions is, do you comply with the word of wisdom, which is a particular set of dietary restrictions? It's kind of like halal or kosher, right? So there are particular
Mhm.
dietary restrictions. And green tea is kind of has been one of these gray areas, right?
Uh-huh.
I can't think of what would be the example, you know, and some of these other dietary things, but I guess maybe like near beer, you know, non-alcoholic beer or something for like
Uh-huh.
Muslims.
Mhm.
Even though it might have a little bit of alcohol content, it's probably fine, you know. And
Mhm.
there's actually been a like well-settled one in
Mhm.
Mormonism, which is decaffeinated coffee, right?
Oh. Mhm.
Yeah, so as long as you drink decaffeinated coffee, that was okay. And I think after a while, you just start to realize that some of this is just arbitrary.
Mhm.
You know, some of these rules, again, are like arbitrary. So I think with
Mhm.
me, like what, and this is only something that I've been able to do, and this is basically the entire subject matter of the second book. With me,
Mhm.
I've been able to kind of tap into like my own intuition about
Mhm.
particular things. And so
Mhm.
now I just follow intuition, and I figure intuition comes from like, it seems like it comes from the source of like light and peace. And if like there's any truth to my religion, it's that God is a God of light and peace. So it has to
Mhm.
be coming from the same source. So now I would ask, you know, rather than just have people tell me XYZ, you know, is wrong or prohibited, I would instead seek an answer from my intuition
Mhm.
to let me know whether or not that was like actually a thing. So I'll give you another quick example. We were on a
Mhm.
Zoom call, my family, my siblings, and my parents and I. And
Uh-huh.
one of my brothers is a Mormon bishop right now,
Oh.
and everybody was
Oh.
showing off their beards, you know, because it's like everybody's doing work from home, everybody's growing in these
Gotcha.
beards,
Mhm.
including my father. And then people asked him, my brother, like, why don't you have a beard? And he kind of showed that he had a little bit of scruff. But then one of the, I forget who it was in my family, said, oh, it's because you're a bishop, right? And I guess there is a tradition that bishops do not have beards for whatever reason, but I think it's just
Interesting.
a tradition. Yes.
Yeah.
But my dad, who for whatever reason is kind of like a letter of the law rather than spirit of the law type person, he
Mhm.
was like, well, they won't let you be a temple worker. They won't let you work in the temple if you have a beard or something, kind of trying to
Ouch.
prove that there was some like greater meaning to this. And I
Mhm.
thought, even if that is a policy, even if that is a current standard, that's a stupid one, right? That doesn't make sense. You know, I don't
Uh-huh.
think it has any bearing on somebody's spirituality, which is
Indeed.
like what you're trying to kind of like track when you're trying to say, you know, whether or
Mhm.
not somebody is like a good candidate for participating in temple worship, right? So
Gotcha.
yeah, so I would I apply kind of that beard standard now. If some people say, you know, green tea's wrong, you know, I wouldn't necessarily believe it, but I
Mhm.
actually have asked intuition about green tea, and intuition says, yeah, just hold off on green tea for now. So there are a lot of
Gotcha.
things that I do that I think
Mhm.
other people from my religion would be surprised at. You know, they would be surprised and even think that I was wrong for. But I just use intuition, and I try my best to live my religion in a personal way, using
Mhm.
personal revelation, personal inspiration from
Mhm.
these sources of light and truth. And I guess that's the best I can do.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thanks. And does anybody else have a question before we wrap up? Maybe like a quick. All right, everybody. So I will definitely try to reschedule with our guest Arthur for next week. Hopefully, I kind of suggested that we do a practice run. We never got around to it. Maybe that's because we're both like a little bit haphazard. You'll see when he comes on, he almost never likes to plan things out, anyways. In fact, when we did that like week trip, we had zero plans. He met me at my hotel lobby. The second day, he met me at like a particular
Perhaps,
site. First day.
so sorry to cut you off, but perhaps like the country he's currently in, perhaps they block Zoom itself. Like some countries are not
Mm,
Zoom friendly or Skype
uh,
friendly, or so perhaps another software.
All right, so we will probably try to schedule it, but yes, he is more free-thinking, free-spirited guy, but I'll try to schedule a practice with him, and maybe we'll even like have a conversation and upload that without you guys, and then have another one with you guys, in which you're able to participate and answer questions.
Sounds great.
All right, thank you everybody, and have a great week, and I will see you next week.
Take it easy.
Bye.
Bye.